he basically was saying, anyone can have a podcast. You should have a podcast. So I thought, yes, now's the time. And it was about 8 months later, I launched my first show called Speaking of Speaking. And it was around that time that I said, why don't more people know about this? And I could teach people how to do this. So I kind of put that on the back shelf and then just kept working my business part-time while working full-time in radio. And then that big C word hit, COVID. You maybe heard of that. And that's when a lot of people, myself included, had to pivot my business because fewer people were, well, no one was getting on physical stages. So I had to pivot my business and say, well, how can I help people in the digital space, in the virtual world? So that was my opportunity then to start a business called...
Hey guys, welcome back to the BID Academy podcast. I'm your host, Alex Thorick, and today I have a very interesting guest, someone who is a very knowledgeable person in the podcasting world. I have Carl Richard, who has spent more than 25 years behind the microphone on radio and on stage, entertaining and influencing audiences worldwide. He is a 3-time best-selling author, TEDx speaker, and MC, host of the Speaking of Speaking podcast, and the founder and CEO of Carl Speaks and Podcast Solutions Made Simple. Carl helps coaches, consultants, and other subject matter experts become the go authority by launching world-class podcasts. He lives with his spouse in Ganagog, Ontario, Canada, where he enjoys camping and boating in the 1,000 Islands. Welcome to the show.
Alex, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, brother. That was a fantastic introduction to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I didn't know that you like camping, and because I would always pass by the 1,000 Islands. My parents went there.
Yeah.
I've never visited that area.
1,000 islands are beautiful. Here's a trick question. How many islands in the
1,000?
1,800, actually.
Oh, yeah?
Something like around 1,800, yeah. But you know what? It's beautiful in the summer. So we get a lot of vacationers here in the summer months visiting some of the islands. And some of those islands are crown land or they're owned by the government. So they have campsites on some of them. So you actually can canoe or kayak, or in our case, we take a boat to the island loaded with camping gear and camp there. Now, we haven't done any tent camping on the islands in a while, but it's beautiful. It's pristine wilderness here. And you know, you can be 10 minutes by boat or by some kind of watercraft away from the shore, and it feels like you're in the middle of nowhere. It really does. It's very, very cool. Love it here. But yeah, camping has been a part of my life for, oh gosh, more years than I can imagine. But but I love it. It's a great way to get back to nature. And in a lot of places, especially when you're in the islands or even other places north, you're out towards Montreal way, so in Quebec, but where I am in Ontario, and for everyone listening that's an international listener, we're in fairly large areas, but we're not far away from remote areas. When you get into some of those remote areas, there's no cell phone reception. So you are forced to unplug, and hopefully you've downloaded a few podcasts to listen to while you are in some of those remote areas. But yeah,
that would actually be a good idea.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah.
Well, interesting. Well, I've never done camping, like never tried. And then my wife looked at me and she's like, "Never in her life?" I'm like, "No." She's like, "Oh, you're such a city boy, but you like countryside?" I'm like, "I guess."
Okay. It's, you know what? Some people love it and some people hate it. Some people's idea of camping is, a 3-star at the Holiday Inn. Like that's as low quality as they'll go as far as amenities and such. Nothing, where there's no mosquitoes or black flies, none of that. And some people and some people on the other hand are like, no, bring it on. I want to be eaten by mosquitoes because that means I'm camping, right? And I want a lumpy, uncomfortable bed that's called the ground because that means that I'm in nature. So, but for some, and as I've gotten a couple of years older, I prefer some creature comforts too. So we actually now have a trailer, just a small pop-up trailer that we can pull behind us. So it just makes life a little bit easier and more comfortable. But for years, I've done tent camping, and not saying I won't go back to it, but the trailer, it's so comfortable. So if you haven't done camping, do the trailer part of it because that will at least give you some good exposure to camping and still have some creature comforts.
Yeah, and then I don't need to lay down on the grass.
Exactly. You don't need to worry about what could be crawling up beside you while you're sleeping, what ants or other field mice or whatever.
Yeah.
Not to scare you away from camping now, mentioning all these things, but it's so worth it. Try it.
Yeah,
love it.
I definitely should.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to get back, I guess, I'd like for you to share how you got started with the radio show and podcasting, and how did this journey begin?
Oh my goodness, how much time do we have? That's like my life story. You want all that in like 3 minutes or less? But no, seriously, I got into radio broadcasting. I originally wanted to be an actor when I was younger, and for every actor that makes it, there's 10,000 working the drive-through saying, "Would you like fries with that?" So my default to that was, well, you know what? There are a lot of people that ended up getting into the world of theater or movies and television that got their start in radio. So, and I really love the concept of theater of the mind. That's what radio is. You hear something and you act on it. And there's a lot of things you can do with radio. Just listen to Orson Welles' depiction of War of the Worlds back from the 1930s. And he literally, if you know the story, he literally had people believing Martians had landed on Earth and people were fleeing their houses. That's the power of that medium. And podcasting isn't much different than that. But I spent 25 years in radio, and between radio jobs, I ended up starting a part-time business actually doing speaker training. And it was when I had that part-time business, which I still have, by the way. But when I started that part-time business, well, one of my Toastmasters colleagues came to me and said, "Oh, you're doing speaker training. Well, you should have a podcast." And I said, "What's a podcast? I've never heard of this thing." So they tried to explain it, and I still didn't understand it. And I said, "You know what? The chances of me ever needing or having a podcast will be slim to nil." And here it is today. Not only do I help people launch podcasts, but I have two of my own podcasts. And that came about by going to an event in Toronto, Canada, and listening to a guy speak. His name is Sam Crowley. I don't know if you've ever heard Sam Crowley, but Sam Crowley
Mm.
has been in the podcasting world since podcasts were in diapers. That's how long he's been doing it. And he basically was saying, anyone can have a podcast. You should have a podcast. So I thought, yes, now's the time. And that was about 8 months later, I launched my first show called Speaking of Speaking. And it was around that time that I said, why don't more people know about this? And I could teach people how to do this. So I kind of put that on the back shelf and then just kept working my business part time while working full time in radio. And then that big C word hit, COVID. You maybe
Hmm.
heard of that. And that's when a lot of people, myself included, had to pivot my business because fewer people were, well, no one was getting on physical stages. So I had to pivot my business and say, well, how can I help people in the digital space, in the virtual world? So that was my opportunity then to start a business called, at that point, we didn't even have branding for it, but the goal was to help people get on podcasts and show them how to create their own. And that worked well for a time. I think we ran 4 programs, and it was around the fourth program where people were coming in the program and loving it. They said, Carl, I'd love to, keep my podcast going once we're done the program, but I don't have time. Can you do it for me? And I said, sure. Not even knowing if podcast production and the agency work that we're doing now, not even knowing if that was a thing. I quickly realized that it was, and then we positioned ourselves somewhere in the middle. Like we're not the most expensive agency out there, but we're also not dirt cheap. Like we do have
Hmm.
a certain level of professionalism that we bring to that. But we help coaches, consultants, and other subject matter experts who feel they don't have the time or the technical skills or know how to launch a podcast. Not only do we help them launch, but we maintain their shows on a monthly basis so they can focus on what's important to them, and that's staying in the lane that they're good at. That's their business, and we can help them be seen as the go-to expert. And we still do some training, but mostly helping people get on the shows and maintain their shows for them.
Interesting. Well, that's quite a story.
That is quite a story. There's more that I can share. There's a lot more color I could give you, but that's the Cole's Notes version of how I got to where I am today.
Awesome. So, if somebody is thinking about starting a podcast, because this is one
Yeah.
of the fastest growing industries, as I know, I started one podcast, and this is the second one that we have. I was going through the stats, and I saw that people, well, there are a lot of podcasts in Asia, and specifically in Japan, I believe.
Mhm.
People listen a ton,
Oh yeah.
and this industry is just starting to grow in Canada and US. So if somebody, let's say, as you mentioned, coaches and consultants, because the information industry, the coaching industry is growing at a crazy speed. The last time I was
Yeah.
checking, at the moment, I think the industry is worth $365 billion a year, and by
Oh, is that
20,
all? Oh, that's not bad. That's chump change. I'm just kidding.
yeah,
Yeah, it's a lot of money. It's
it
huge.
is. Yeah, and then by 2030, it's supposed to be at around a trillion. So it should triple by then.
Yeah, yeah.
And podcasting is one of the best tools, I would say, to build
Mm.
that following and to have the personal connection with the audience. And another stat that I was looking at, 60% or 70% of listeners, they are six-figure earners. So everyone is trying to do their high ticket coaching or whatnot. What would you suggest people to do with the podcast? How should they get started?
Oh my goodness. Also, how much time do we have? But no, seriously, I think the first thing that people need to do is they need to decide, yes, I want a podcast. What tends to happen though when people start exploring this in a little bit more detail is they throw up the blinders and they say, I can't do this. And there's five basic reasons why they can't do it. There's five myths that are holding people back from getting into the podcast space. And I can cover those very quickly for you if you like.
Sure.
The first myth is the money myth. And the money myth is where people say, I just don't have the money, but they're really saying the wrong thing. They're not necessarily saying they don't have the money, especially if they're high level coaches. What they're saying is they can't see the value in it. But once you understand the value, and the value proposition is how many of my clients and prospects are out there already listening to podcasts who aren't listening to mine because I don't have one. And
Hmm.
let's face it, people are looking for you. People are looking for you in the podcasting space. Just like people don't go to the yellow pages anymore to order a pizza. They pull open their phone, they go to their local pizzeria, and they hit the button and they call. That's how they do it. That's why the yellow pages have gone from being like a pulpit Bible size to being the size of a leaflet that you get in the mail. That's why. So same thing with podcasting. There's people are looking for social proof. They're going to look for it there. And so it's not about the money, it's about the value. All right. And people are also when it comes to the money, they're saying, well, how's my podcast going to make money? It's not about your podcast making you money. It's about you providing enough value and a call to action in every episode that people can't help but contact you to get your free PDF or your other gifts that you have. And then social proof, then they're going to do business with you at the appropriate time. So the money myth is the first one. The second one is the competition myth. There's just too many out there, right? Well, let me share this stat with you. For every 500 blogs, roughly, and there are a lot of bloggers I know, people who still put out 1,000-word blogs. For every 500 blogs out there, there's one podcast.
Oh, wow.
Now those numbers are changing, obviously, as more people get into the podcast space. But if you're a blogger, why not merge those two together? Why not have a blog that has fewer words and a link to your video or your MP3 link, so that way people can digest your content at their leisure when they have time, when they're doing something else, as opposed to dedicating time to read, because people hate to read. People really hate to read. The other part of the competition myth, by the way, Alex, and I think you know this, is there are some people out there who are very famous who have podcasts. Joe Rogan, Oprah Winfrey, Jack Canfield, Tony Robbins. We look at those names and go, oh, wait a minute, I'm just not famous enough. The famous people, they represent probably less than 5% of the podcasters, maybe even only 1% or less of the podcasters out there. A lot of them are like you and I, who are, unknown to a lot of people, but can be seen as the go-to expert if we just put our content out there. So that's the competition myth. The third one is the content myth. And the content myth, quite simply, is what am I going to talk about? What am I going to share with people? We have content already. If you're a coach or a consultant, you've already no doubt created programs, courses,
Yeah.
workshops. You've held webinars. You've maybe even held your own conferences. You've done Facebook Lives. You've done all sorts of things. You've written blogs to create that content. So it's not about content creation. It's about content curation. It's about now taking the content that you've already created, your intellectual property, and making it user friendly for a podcast. Is that simple? There's a few things that you need to know to do that. But once you figure out that system or that way to do it, and you have that templated, or you have that as a systematized, so you're not reinventing the wheel every time you do an episode, it's really simple. But it's not about creating it, it's about curating it. And any new content you create, you'll realize that, okay, not only is this for my book or for my blog or for my program, it's podcast material as well. So that's the content myth. The fourth myth is the fourth myth is the tech myth. It's too technical, it's too confusing, and I get that one too because it was techie and confusing for me at first. And I have a background in media and broadcasting. But here's the thing. I don't fix my own car if for no other reason my spouse would kill me. Every time I'd pop open the hood, I'd get the, what are you doing? What's wrong with the car? But when I need something fixed, where do I go? I take my car to the auto mechanic. If I need to have my appendix removed, I don't try and do it myself. I go to the expert. You
Yeah.
don't need to know everything. All you need to know is that, oh, there's a podcasting thing out there. I wonder who I know who can help me with that. As opposed to how am I going to do this? It's who do I know that can help me do this? It's two completely different thoughts, but most people get hung up on the how. What they should be asking is who. So that's the tech myth. And the fifth myth is the time myth. And you've probably experienced this yourself in recording your own episodes and in your early investigations and figuring out how long a show should be. There are podcasts out there that are 2 minutes long. There are podcasts out there that are 2 hours long. And let me share with you, you don't have to do a 2 hour podcast. You can if you like, but you should be asking, how long can my audience be engaged by what I'm sharing? Is it 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour? The sweet spot, and there's a stat out there about this, the sweet spot, the average podcast out there is between 20 and 35 minutes. So if
Hmm.
you're falling somewhere in there, yeah. A
I
lot of
didn't know
people are
that.
surprised. They think they have to go an hour or they have to Joe Rogan it up and go 2 hours and be controversial. You don't have to. As a matter of fact, people might prefer if you didn't go that route. People would say, you know what? I can engage you for 20 minutes. 30 minutes tops. Think about how long it takes you, the average person. And I'm not talking about big city dwellers where their morning commute is longer, but the average person, their commute time is anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah,
Right.
around there.
In some cases it's 10, right? But if you can engage your audience with an episode in 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes tops, with a call to action in it, every single episode they listen to, you now have engagement and you now have a following. But to really figure out the time, it's and you'll understand this, it takes less time to pare down and edit and fix and mix down a 2 hour episode than it does a 20-minute episode. Law of numbers, right? I
Yeah.
mean, less time I take recording, the less time I'm going to need to fix it up. So that's the five myths. And those are the things that are holding a lot of people back. But once they figure out that, oh, those are myths, I just need to have a conversation with somebody who knows what they're doing to help me on the path, then more people will jump in. Are there other things that are relevant? Absolutely, and we can talk about some of those too. But those are some of the reasons why they don't. And once they figure some of that out, man, it's such a great place to be. Well, Alex, I mean, you have a couple of podcasts.
Yeah.
It's awesome having a show every week and having listeners reach out to you and say, "I love your show," or "Your conversation with Carl, that was fantastic."
I'm sure we're
And
gonna get
it speaks
those.
to your credibility. I hope so, because if I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed, sometimes people don't comment on specific, let's say if it's a video or it was a podcast, and they don't necessarily engage publicly, or they don't text you or email you. But then when you meet with them in person, they tell you, "Oh, I was listening to that episode." And I'm like,
Yeah.
"Why didn't you leave a review? That helps. Just please, we ask for that on every episode."
Yeah, it's
But
true. It's true.
yeah, people are always listening, and
Yeah,
most of the times they like what they hear. I mean, that's why they
yeah,
stick around, pretty much.
yeah, yeah. And it's certainly great when they do. And the other trepidation that sometimes people have is they say, "What if I'm not ready to be a host?" And there's a lot of people out there who are not ready to be podcast hosts. I, for one, wasn't ready when that's why it took me so long. But there are people who will start their podcasting journey by being a guest.
Hmm.
They'll make that their modus operandi. They'll make that their plan is to, rather than host their own show, get on as many shows as they can over the course of a year or 18 months or 2 years, and then reassess whether or not being their own host is right for them. We actually are in the process of getting a client set to launch who did exactly that. She spent 18 months guesting on podcasts. We had a discussion shortly after she was a guest on my show and figured out that let's have a conversation. And it was about a year ago that we had that conversation. And here we are getting ready to launch her podcast. But she started out being a guest. And you can do that too. Get your feet wet by being a guest and getting on as many shows as you can. So you can, again, it's putting your expertise, letting people know that you are an expert. And that's the best way to do it. Just like 30 years ago, if you were an expert, you'd write a book and you'd go
Hmm.
on a book tour. You'd be on every radio station because they'd want to have you on as a guest. Podcasting is pretty much the same thing.
So a similar thing as guest blogging in a way.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
a way, yeah, exactly. Or and there are still people that write books. I'm not saying don't write a book. But if you're going to write a book, you should also be thinking, how do I, again, content curation, how do I then take that book and turn it into a podcast? And by
Hmm.
the way, if you create a podcast, you should also be thinking, how do I turn this content into a book? Because it works both
Vice
ways. It's
versa.
very cool. Yeah, there's a lot of cross pollination in that. So, but don't dismiss it just because you're not ready to have your own show. I mean, Alex is a great guy. He might have you on the show. I might have you on the show. It never hurts to ask. And some people even hire an agency to help them get on other shows too. So there's many different options for people who want to get into the podcasting space. And there's podcasts about everything. So it doesn't really matter what your subject material is. There's a podcast out there for you to be on, and probably several.
Yeah, and then there is even a podcast about podcasting, right?
Yeah, there aren't that many. That's why I actually started a
Yeah.
podcast all about podcasting, and you were a guest on that recently, and that episode will be published. Yeah, there are podcasts about podcasting. There are a lot of podcasts about real estate. There are a lot of podcasts about health and wellness. So if you're a wellness coach, for example, you should get on some health and wellness podcasts. There are podcasts about marketing.
Oh yeah.
Get on some marketing podcasts. There are a lot of them actually. There are podcasts about tech, DevOps,
Money,
UX
finances.
design, money, finance, and then you have the some of the top podcasts aren't necessarily ones you want to be on because those would be the true crime podcasts, for example.
Oh,
I don't think you
seriously?
want to be on the true. Yeah, I think true crime is one of the top five categories for podcasts. But you have sports, you have entertainment, you have um, comedy, you also have even religion. So if you're a religious
Hmm.
person, you're a or you're a spiritual person. There are a lot of spiritual podcasts out there. Some of them are religious based, some of them are more medium type podcasts, but there is a ton of podcasts out there that can serve you.
That is amazing.
Yeah,
And we can reach
yeah,
it at, well, everything is pretty much in our phones.
exactly. If you're carrying around this box that we call a phone, just go to your podcast app, be it Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever app you're using. Just go to the search menu and type in a subject that you're interested in. And then, if you're in business, if you're a coach or consultant, or let's say you're working with Alex right now, uh, click on your industry and see what podcasts come up. That's what I did when I started my show. I started searching because my first podcast was all about public speaking and professional presentations. I searched public speaking. Guess what comes up? A lot of podcasts for Toastmasters and TED and TEDx.
Hmm.
But then the deeper dive you do when you do public speaking techniques or public speaking tips or stage fright, or you just start typing all of those in. A two thumb texter, I guess. You do that, you'll see there's a barrage of them. And I also found out as I was going through that, some of my savvy competitors, also, not only did they have great websites with great content on them, they also had podcasts. But what also was interesting, there were people who I would consider to be extremely well known in the speaking world or in the professional speaking space or speaker training space that don't have podcasts. And
Hmm.
that was eye opening because then that told me that, you know what, there's a spot for me for sure. So don't ever dismiss it, but do your research and do your homework and figure out what you want to talk about. That's the first thing. Whenever we have a discovery call, when I have somebody on a podcast strategy session with me, I'll say, what's your podcast going to be about? It's the first question out of my mouth. What's your podcast going to be about? And if the person at the other end doesn't know what it's going to be about, they're not ready. So we'll usually talk through it a little bit. We'll talk a bit about their business, find out more about what their business is about. But sometimes the podcast isn't about their business. It's about their passion project or it's about a hobby. But we can find that out and then ask yourself, okay, what's the result you want? So we know what the podcast is about. What's the result? What's the purpose? Why are you doing the show? What do you want to achieve? by having this podcast? Is it more clients? Is it more awareness? Is it because you have nothing to do on a Saturday afternoon? You want people to know that your love is gardening or woodworking. And hey, if that's what it is, that's that's awesome. We're here to help you with that.
Yeah, that's
Um,
passion.
but that's the big thing, is what's your passion? Mine is speaking and podcasting, which is part of speaking, right? Um, and the Speaking podcast has had a lot of different guests on it too. So we've kind of stretched the boundaries of spoken word and communication and bring in some different concepts. But that's where you start. Start asking
Interesting.
yourself, what is my podcast going to be about? What is the goal I want to achieve? How much do I how much more business do I want to bring in using my podcast?
That's a good question to ask as well. What
Mhm.
was the main goal? Because the first podcast that I started it because two of my mentors would just preach and say like, start a podcast, start publishing, start publishing. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna listen to what they say. We'll see what's gonna happen. I wasn't even sure what's gonna come out of that, and
Right.
people were listening to it, but then I didn't really publish on a consistent basis, so I decided to pause that, and then eventually I closed it, and then we launched a new one, which is the BID Academy.
Awesome. And I bet it's going very well for you, and it's you're seeing the results of that. And if the worst thing that can happen is, or you don't get a client from it, but you're putting your expertise forward, really. But if you don't do it, I was running some numbers earlier, and it's surprising. It's actually staggering how low the numbers are. But even if you run extremely low numbers, let's say your average episode only gets 25 listens. It's nothing. It's peanuts.
Hmm.
And let's say only 5% of those people end up reaching out to you, right? You're doing an episode a week, one person a week reaches out to you. So that means 52 people a year reach out to you. Say half of those people aren't your ideal client and they're not really going to do business with you. Well, now you're down to 26. Well, let's say half of those people aren't quite ready to do business with you, or they want to do it or they want to go in another direction. So now you're down to 13. These are really low numbers too, by the way, extremely
Yeah.
low. Let's say you've got 13 new clients in the next year. Figure out what your average client is worth to you. And I know what it's worth to me. And 13 new clients a year to me, that puts me in a totally different income bracket
Oh
altogether.
yeah.
But it puts our company, just to give you, and again, this is not to impress you, just to impress upon you and just let you know that these are the numbers. That puts our company at between a quarter and half $500,000
Hmm.
from 13 new clients. That's it.
That's
So
that's impressive.
so and that's my numbers. Everyone's got their own numbers, right? So if you're a coach or a consultant and you're thinking, yeah, what is it? What's a client worth to you? Is it $10,000 each? Is it $20,000? Is it 5,000? Are you new to the coaching world? Is it a lower ticketed item? Is it $500 per client? Because even if it is, don't dismiss it, because those numbers, your
Oh yeah.
coaches will tell you to raise your prices anyways if you have a savvy business coach. But hey, those numbers are your numbers. But look at them and go, a client is worth this much to me. And therefore, why am I leaving money on the table? That's the thing. If you're leaving money on the table, end of the year, you go to your accountant and say, well, we didn't do so well. Your accountant says, well, how much money did you leave on the table? Well, I didn't have a podcast and I said no to 13 people. You know what I mean? So play with it a little bit and figure out, yeah, okay, I could do this. Not only can I do this, but I know that the value, if I land client, one client a month average. Let's say I said
Pretty
13, but let's say
much.
it's
Yeah.
one. Let's say it's one client a month you get because you have a podcast and all the other marketing things that you're doing. I'm not going to do a deeper dive into that. You get one client a month, and you can tell it's a direct result because somebody's tuning into your podcast. You just won.
That's a huge win. Yeah. And people, for some
Yeah,
reason, people underestimate it. Well, I guess as you mentioned earlier, people think that it's way too complicated when in reality it's not. I mean, you do need to invest a little bit of time and learn how to do it
yeah.
and hire some experts and get help from experts and let them do the work pretty much.
Yeah, there are some things you need to do, and Alex has a nice microphone there. I have a microphone too that I typically will use when I'm recording an episode. But if you have earbuds, for example, and they're a good, crisp, clean pair of earbuds, those will work. So you don't have to spend a gajillion dollars on a microphone. Not that Alex's is that much, but you also don't have to. People think you have to set up a studio.
No.
Can you? Can you? Absolutely. If you want to set up a studio, we're actually working with a prospect right now. That's exactly what they want to do. But that's in their wheelhouse. That's in their budget. That's the level of business that they play at. They want a studio, right? They want it. We're like,
Hmm.
okay, fine. We'll help you set that up and we'll get your podcast going too. But you don't have to set up a 50, 75, $100,000 studio state of the art. Is there a space in your house that you can, you know, or the space where you do your work at home? It, I know people that do their podcasts, record their episodes at their dining room table.
Yeah.
So
That's that's how I started my first podcast, actually.
yeah. I used to do mine. Where did I used to do mine? Oh, actually, I've always done mine in either a spare bedroom or an office. But now I have a dedicated office studio that I do it in. But when I started my show, it was a spare bedroom, so there was soundproofing because of the bed, right, and the
Hmm.
curtains, and we had a rug on the floor, which would improve the sound dampening as well. Yeah, and I didn't even have this same microphones that I have today. I had it really was a good microphone, but it was a tabletop and it was very low to the table. So I had to try and put it on a stand, or I had to hold it to get to so I could record my episodes. But again, you learn all these things as you go, right? And don't think that your first 10 episodes are going to be world class. They probably won't be, but just grow with it. I remember my first 10 episodes. I love them. I don't go back and listen to them, but I love them. But I know people do go back and listen to them and they say, wow, this is great, fantastic content. Um, you get better as you go.
Yeah.
It's like anything. But leave that content there for people to explore, because you never know when that's going to lead you. Maybe one of those first 10 episodes you did is going to lead you to your next client. Maybe it's the last episode. You don't know. But the biggest thing, I think the biggest message I can impart today is, especially with podcasting, as you said, Alex, it's growing in leaps and bounds. If not now, then when? If not now, then when? I remember talking to people 2.5 years ago saying they're going to launch a podcast and still haven't. And remember those client numbers I just talked about a minute ago? Imagine if
Yeah.
they had added 26 clients minimum. Like,
It definitely doesn't hurt.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how, for some reason, people, as I said, underestimate the power of podcasting.
Oh, it's extremely powerful.
Yeah.
Extremely powerful. Just like the power of radio, as I mentioned earlier. And it's not going away. I remember having that discussion with somebody back in 2019 when this was still an idea about doing the podcast marketing and agency work. And I remember him saying, and this is a guy that still runs, I believe, still runs a website development company.
Hmm.
Okay. So a very technology based, forward thinking company. And I remember him saying, are you sure podcasts just aren't a fad that just pie in the sky? They're just going to eventually fade away. No, this was 2019. And if you think back to 2019, I believe there were about 750,000, maybe a million podcasts back then. And at the recording of this episode, which is February of 2023, there's right around 3 million podcasts now.
Oh, wow.
So the industry has grown. So it's not going away. If anything, it's expanding, and there's room for you in the playing field. Alex and I would love to have you come and play podcasting with us. It's
That'd be
it's
great.
it's fun. It's awesome.
It is fun. It's always fun
Yeah,
to, well, interview people like yourself
yeah,
and
uh,
get some of those golden nuggets based
yeah,
on what you're doing, and especially in your
yeah.
case, you're the expert in
Yeah.
this topic.
And it's and if anyone wants to reach out and have a conversation with me, I'm happy to do that. So if anyone wants to have a conversation with me about podcasting, they want to find out more about my podcast, they want to explore their own podcast, or even being a guest, like, we can have a conversation about anything you want to talk about, uh,
Where can
preferably preferably
where
about podcasting.
yeah, where can they find you then?
Yeah, the website is Podcast Solutions Made Simple. And if you go to the back page, there's a link there to my calendar. But you can also, if you're ready to get started, then you can just click on the the link on anywhere in the website, and it'll get you to me, and we can have a conversation from there. So
Awesome. So it's
yeah,
podcastmadesimple.com.
yeah. So it's Podcast Solutions
Oh, so yeah,
Made Simple.com. Yeah, I should emphasize .com.
yeah,
Yeah, and I can make that link available if you like, Alex.
yeah. Absolutely, we'll definitely add it to the show notes and have it there, and maybe have the direct link. Can people find somewhere, or can they find you on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. Search Carl Richards on LinkedIn. Actually, you can find Podcast Solutions Made Simple on LinkedIn as well, which will link to me as well. Instagram, Twitter. You can find me on all of those social sites. We usually post to. We do a lot of work right now on Facebook and LinkedIn. We are doing a little bit more push to get some Instagram reels going, but we also do promote both of them through Twitter. It's a great playing field for us for just promoting stuff in the here and now. But reach out on social media too, because we do share a lot of great things outside of just the podcast episodes. There, we share some other great content as well.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for coming today. I appreciate your time, and as I always like to say, time is the most valuable asset. So I do really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.